Okay, so Friedwardt Winterberg. I want to go through a list of names. I've been taking notes. We have spent all week working with Friedwardt's family to try and get, basically, we've been trying to archive his materials. So the friends, colleagues, and people that he corresponded with include Hermann Oberth, George Miley, Robert Bussard, J. Allen Hynek, Jacques Vallée, Edward Teller, Stanislav Ulam, Paul Dirac. He was the winner of the Hermann Oberth Award Medal and very close friends with him, very close friends with Edward Teller as well. And let me see, his PhD advisor was Werner von Heisenberg. He was friends and corresponded with Dr. Robert L. Forward, as well as more recent figures who are still with us, like Drs. Eric Davis, Hal Puthoff, and then, of course, I have him down at the bottom here, the legendary Carl Sagan, who has passed, right? So the reason that I mention these names is this was, like, as you've described him, this was like a gold medalist in terms of physics, right?
Absolutely. Dr. Winterberg, he was brought over in 1959 under Project Paperclip. He was 16 at the end of the war in 1945. And so he went on to college for physics. He ended up doing very well. And as you said, he studied under Heisenberg, which was a very important figure in the history of all physics. So when he was brought over in 1959, it was because he was working on fusion ideas and other nuclear-related stuff. And so everybody was chomping at the bit to get at this guy. He had letters of invitations from like every university out there, every government agency out there. Everybody wanted a piece of this guy. And he eventually settled for working for a place called the Case Institute over in, I believe, Ohio or Pennsylvania. Okay. So the Case Institute was 4 years of his life. He transitioned from there as an associate professor in atmospheric physics, because when you explode a bomb, you need to know how that fallout is going to transfer through the atmosphere. So that was his jam. He didn't like working on weapons technology. He didn't want to work on anything weapons. Since age 10, all he ever wanted was to have alternative propulsion ideas that would get us out in space. That was his whole goal in life, was propulsion. It eventually led him towards working on fusion-related things. Because when you look at propulsion, you inevitably end up looking at energy requirements on how much energy is it going to take to make me go fast. So that was the majority of his career, was surrounding the two topics of alternative propulsion as well as energy.
Okay, so again, I mean, tremendous figure, came over with Operation Paperclip. He studied under Werner von Heisenberg, who is one of the absolute heavyweights in physics, right? So this is a highly credible individual. The United States government felt that way, as well as the nuclear establishment once he got into it, right? This was as credible and establishment as you can get.
Yep, so in 1970, after he had transitioned out of Case and was working over at Desert Research Institute for a while, the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, they ended up giving him Q clearance for 4 years, from 1970 to 1974. You don't get Q clearance without being a somebody, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's really high-level secret stuff. So during that time, he was figuring out how you could detonate or ignite a nuke using lasers or impact, rather than having a smaller charge explode inside a cavity to make the bigger charge actually explode, which was, up until that point, the Teller-Ulam model. That's what that is you have this egg-shaped thing with a small bomb and a big bomb, and the small bomb makes the big bomb go off. Well, because he'd been working with these toroidal fusion reactor ideas, he figured out there's a lot of different ways that you can make material that is radioactive, nuclear, fissile material. There's other ways that you can make it explode. Now, even though he didn't want to work on that kind of stuff, he also was very good about advocating for his ideas. And when he saw an application for his ideas, he felt the need to justify those ideas to anybody that would listen, right? And so that was one angle. He ended up becoming friends with Ed Teller back in around May of 1964. That was when Dr. Winterberg went over to Los Alamos National Labs for the first time and gave a big presentation to everybody there on his idea of impact fusion, where it's this idea that you're circulating these levitating superconducting balls around in a circle, and then they slam into each other at the right moment and you get fusion. That was his main claim to fame. That was the biggest thing that he's probably going to be remembered for, is how much he contributed to different methods of fusion.
Well, so I have seen, going through his papers over the last week with you, right? We have been going through, working with his daughter Astrid and her partner Jason, trying to help the family archive and organize and scan some of the valuable materials that never made it into, publication. And so I've seen a couple of big trends there. As you mentioned, one of them is fusion, like bombs, for lack of a better word, right? And there are so many different variations on that, like, how to start a fusion detonation using lasers, how to start a fusion detonation with electron beams, things along those lines. That is one path of his research that is throughout his career, right? It's there. Even though he didn't seem to be very weapons focused, it's something that was part, I guess, of his professional life. Another part of his life that I thought was very interesting was he was fascinated by UFOs. And Astrid has said he went back and forth on it, I think, to some degree, right? And so she isn't completely sure what his opinion was, but one of the things that you found was a letter to Edward Teller about a book he was working on, where he pointed out a UFO in a photo that Teller had sent him, right? So this was not only something that was an interest for him, and he had dozens of magazines, maybe hundreds of newsletters from J. Allen Hynek's organization, correspondence with Hynek and others. This appears to be a topic that a lot of those physicists had an interest in at the time.
Yep. So Dr. Hynek, after he finished Project Blue Book in around, I think, 1969, by 1973, Dr. Hynek realized that about 5% of the cases he worked on were legitimate cases that had no good explanation. And so he he invited a lot of these other scientists and professionals in their fields to create what he called the Invisible College. I think Jacques Vallée called it the Invisible College. And on that board, it was called QFOS, or the Center for UFO Studies. In 1973, Dr. Hynek started this organization. On the board, it was invite only. You could only get in if Hynek and others wanted you in because you were a heavy hitter. Well, Dr. Winterberg was one of the biggest heavy hitters in his field. So he was sitting on the board. He wasn't just a member, he was on the board of this organization from about 1973 when it started until at least 1976 is the latest document I've found, though he may have still been an active member for longer. I know that in the early 80s, there's further documents where they're still referencing his work as they're trying to describe how do these UFOs fly, how do they operate.
Yeah.
And on top of that, that Herman Oberth Award that Dr. Winterberg was given around 1979, that award was, so for everybody who doesn't know, Herman Oberth is one of those Nazi rocketry, father of modern rocketry guys, right? A fun aside fact is that Herman Oberth married Winterberg's cousin.
And if I could interject, Dr. Kevin Newth recently has cited extensive studies and analysis of UFOs by Herman Oberth. So again, this was kind of a community interest, I think.
Yep. So the reason why Dr. Winterberg was given this very prestigious award from Dr. Oberth was because Dr. Winterberg came up with this idea called Project Daedalus. And this is another thing that he is very well known for. Project Daedalus was the idea that if you wanted to accelerate your spaceship to fast enough speeds to get to the next star system, one way you could do it is to have a big deflector dish on the back side, and you could have a bunch of very small bombs, a bunch of small nukes already lined up in a string of beads along the path that you're going to go, and as you're going by it, that thing detonates and it blasts you forward and accelerates you faster. Well, that was like the version 1.0, but Dr. Winterberg ended up improving upon that idea significantly. He figured out that you could use a plasma sheath on the surface of this curved deflector dish that creates a magnetically repulsive field that protects the dish from getting damaged during each of these explosions. He also figured out that you can use much smaller explosions more rapidly. Rather than one bomb located, every couple 100,000 kilometers, here you could have a string of these little things already on board, and you could just detonate them repeatedly underneath the craft. And so this craft could have a half sphere deflector dish underneath it and use these micro explosions to levitate it and to allow it to operate in very thin atmosphere or space conditions.
Well, so this takes us into the third major aspect of his work that I saw, which was basically fusion-based propulsion, right? And there were all manner of ideas that he explored there. And again, everything relating to how to more efficiently and effectively do fusion-related propulsion. I mean, he just went through idea after idea after idea. And so that connected him with Dr. Robert L. Forward. His interest in SETI connected him with Carl Sagan. Again, he had this, I guess, diversity of interests that were focused around future spaceflight. And, along with that, it was, what will we encounter? What kind of beings are out there, and are they already here, right? So again, to me, this seems like a common interest. But what's really intriguing is not only his credibility, not only his pedigree, right? I mean, this is a world-class physicist, and it's well known. He was not hiding out, right? He won the Hermann Oberth Award, right? He corresponded, he was best friends with Teller. He knew all of these top-tier scientists in the nuclear establishment. And yet, he had this interest in UFOs. His daughter Astrid said that he drove down to Area 51 many times. That was something she'd said. And that was a thing that we had to look up, because if I understand correctly, you found that he may have been going to Area 11, which is nuclear test sites down there, and not actually Area 51. Right?
Correct, yeah. So everybody hears Area 51 and thinks that's where we keep all the good sauces and alien stuff. So Area 51 is a small section inside the much larger section, which is the Nevada test site. And the Nevada test site is huge, it's massive, and it has area number whatevers all over the place. So during the end of the 1980s, he was working on helping the government figure out how they were going to get rid of their spent radioactive materials. We needed some hole in the ground somewhere where we can dump our dirt or our bad stuff and let it just decay for the next couple tens of thousands of years without hurting anybody. So he was hired to check and see how much of that was going to be leaching into the groundwater over near the Yucca Mountains, which is on the pretty southwestern side of the Nevada test site. For reference, Area 51 is kind of more smack dab in the middle of the whole thing, because that's how you keep it secure.
Okay, so there definitely is kind of a correlation there, and then there are a lot of questions. And one of the biggest questions is where he was actually going. Astrid had said that he would joke with her specifically about going to Area 51. He was joking about UFOs, and of course we knew that he had this UFO interest. She also told me repeatedly that when she was a young girl, he would take her to UFO fairs, right? So again, there's just a personal interest. It is worth noting, and I think you and I both saw this, he compartmentalized these things very well in his notes. So in terms of everything that he archived, he had a box labeled UFOs, and that was all of his UFO stuff. And then he would have other boxes for like fusion propulsion and new physics. He also worked on a new model of physics. You have a copy of the book there, the Planck Aether Hypothesis, right?
Yep. So this book, he started working on it back in the 70s. He'd been working on this model for a very long time. And he ended up finally getting the book written around the year 2000, and then he created the second edition here that fixed some of those minor errors that the first one had. So this is the one that he has the most copies of, and the most copies that are out there. I haven't fully gone through the book yet, but I am already somewhat familiar with his idea of this Planck ether, which is a very unique grand unified theory. Dr. Winterberg branched out into a lot of different areas of study. He didn't pigeonhole himself just in fusion research. Like I said a moment earlier, he was working on this underground water contamination thing, right? That's way outside of fusion. And then he was working on the atmospheric physics in his early career. He worked in a lot of different areas. In the theoretical domain, he created this grand unified theory based upon dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of other smaller parts of this idea throughout the decades. And then he finally coalesced all of those ideas into a single idea that seemed to make pretty good sense. This idea is part of what's related to his ideas for negative mass propulsion. And that's a whole field in and of itself, because a lot of people hear negative mass and they kind of wince. They go, there can't be any such thing as negative mass. Well, Dr. Winterberg, gold medalist level theoretical physicist, he thought that there was a way that not only was it real, but that there was a way to access it, that there's a way to go harvest this stuff that exists in certain places. One of the most wild ideas he had was he wanted to create a hole from one side of the moon to the other. He wanted to create a hole through the whole thing, because at that time, during the SDI days of the 80s, they figured out that you could do tunneling with nukes. You could make these really long tunnels, really wide tunnels, very rapidly with these specialized nuclear explosions. And so according to his model, all this negative mass seems to collect in the center of very large bodies. So his idea was you could start on one side of the moon with your spaceship, the gravity pulls you through and accelerates you, you can scoop up the negative mass in the middle of the moon, and then you can use that for added propulsion to help you escape that gravity, so you can use the whole moon itself as like a railgun launcher. It's a wild idea, one of many wild ideas that Dr. Winterberg had.
Well, so this takes us, I think, to the big question that initially got you interested in him. And you have read dozens, if not hundreds, of his papers online, right? You have been following his work closely for 3 years, which is actually how we got in touch with his family. We were reaching out, trying to get in touch with him, trying to follow up on papers and the themes that he'd worked on. And we found out that he had recently passed, and then, you know, things progressed from there. So you got interested in him based on the TR-3B, which is a rumored, speculative, man-made UFO, I guess, right? So
yeah, for people who don't know, from December of 1989 until about March, April of 1990, over in Belgium, there was over 1,500 sightings of these black flying triangles all over the place. Now, normally with UFO encounters of one kind or another, you don't see such a high number of repeated incursions into the same area by the same craft, right?
Yeah.
And so because of that, that particular incident, there's a lot of other incidents with flying triangles out there, but that particular incident really gets me going. And the reason why is because that looks like a military operation more than just about any other thing that I've seen. So if it's a military operation, that suggests that it may have been a man-made craft that somebody at some point had recently made. And for that time in history, 1989 to 1990, the Cold War was like starting to wind down, but there was a lot of tensions going on because a lot of people in the Soviets and a lot of people in the US government, neither one necessarily wanted it to end or thought it was safe for it to end. So this could have been a show of force of one kind or another in order to make it so that it would end peacefully without the exchange of nukes like everybody expected the Cold War to end. So from that incident, I got really focused on this flying triangle, and I started trying to find out anybody that could have been associated to the development of this. One person's name that seemed to keep coming up over and over and over was Dr. Winterberg, and the reason why is because of his fusion work. When you look at how this craft seems to operate, it becomes very readily apparent that it's utilizing fusion. Very readily apparent. Even more so, on the center underside of all of these flying triangles, they have the same exact deflector dish with the same exact oscillating plasma explosion that Dr. Winterberg talks about in his Project Daedalus stuff. So all of these arrows keep pointing back to Dr. Winterberg. So this week, as we've gone through and we've archived his stuff, we've looked through every single thing the guy has, which is a lot.
Tons.
Literal tons of papers. We didn't find a single literal smoking gun on, here's this craft that I worked on, that, right? Throughout the years, based upon his letters and his other correspondences he had, I can see that his documents have been cleaned up multiple times.
Yeah.
Especially once he lost his Q clearance in 1974. When that happened, a lot of his stuff got cleaned up, and then in the later 70s, it happened again, and then in the early 90s, it happened again. So it's not necessarily all that surprising that we didn't find the smoking gun. That said, if you take a zoomed out aerial view of his work and you look at the other work that the Air Force labs were doing at the time, it starts coming back into focus that his ideas, he was never able to be a part of the development of any of his ideas, but it sure looks like his ideas were indeed utilized by other people, by other groups, especially around that time frame. Edwards Air Force Base is one place that he seemed to correspond with a lot. So he may have even known that his ideas were being used, and he may have still corresponded with people to help them develop it. But none of those correspondences are necessarily the smoking gun that we were looking for. If anything, they're just hints at where to start looking next.
Well, and that in itself isn't that surprising. Again, there's a game involved with clearances and funding and a lot of back office politics that's involved with this, right? And the fact that he didn't want to go along with the program, so to speak, in terms of developing weapons may have basically put him on the outside of this, right?
Yep. Also, in 1974, the way that he lost that Q clearance, what happened was, in and around 1971, 1972, he published a paper that was how to detonate a hydrogen bomb using lasers. And that got the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission that had given him his clearance, that got them really mad because it was a public paper that he had just published, and they determined that it had classified information in it, even though they removed that determination within a few months later. Nevertheless, the fact that he caused them trouble in that way, because he was public about his research, that was enough that they didn't want to deal with him anymore. They were afraid that, oh, this guy's a loose cannon, he might leak some other secrets that we will have to, clean up after him for. So it's not necessarily all that surprising that if he did continue to work on secret stuff after that fact, that he would have been doing it as an outsider, right? So they would ask him a very vague question. He could give them a very specific answer that then would help the people who are working on the technologies.
Well, and so this takes us into this very murky gray area of whether or not he was an insider in any way. And the reason I say that's kind of a murky area is even if you don't have a clearance, if you are good friends with Edward Teller, as he was, right, then it's entirely possible that he had an idea what was going on, what was being developed, even if he didn't have clearances for it. Did you see anything that kind of indicated that?
Sort of. In a number of correspondences between him and Dr. Teller, you can tell that they had a lot of conversations that were not recorded, because they would reference, like, based upon our previous conversation, right?
Yeah.
But I would look back and I would look for that previous conversation, and he doesn't have any record of it anywhere. And this man kept meticulous records. In one document I found, he said that he had over 100,000 pages in all of these 2-inch 3-ring binders, right? Because he had a binder for about every 6 months of his professional career, starting back in the 60s all the way up until the 2000s. This man kept meticulous records of every correspondence he ever had with anyone about anything. So when I see him talking about things that him and Dr. Teller were having conversations about, and there's no other records of that, I'm going to assume that those were in-person conversations. They probably weren't even talking about it over the phone. But Dr. Winterberg made plenty of trips over to Los Alamos National Labs, as well as Sandia, because those are the two places that were working on all of these fusion concepts. And he was visiting those places all the way up until the end of his career.
Yeah. Well, and so again, just to kind of reiterate, because this had been one of the things we'd wondered about, when Astrid had talked about Area 51, your thought was maybe she got confused and he meant Los Alamos. And so we followed up with her on that, and she said, no, he absolutely said Area 51. He was talking about UFOs. He said it in a joking way. He's like, Astrid, I'm going. Wouldn't you like to go with me? You know, so that at least was what he told her, right? And again, it could have been Area 11, I guess, which is, you know, fusion, fission, research, testing areas that are in a different part of the Nevada test range.
Yep, there's a lot of underground nuclear testing that goes on in the entire Nevada test site. And Area 11 is one of those areas where they have these underground tests going, which is part of the reason why they were looking into how is the radiation from these tests leaking into the groundwater. One of Dr. Winterberg's hobbies prior to this was geology and understanding how rocks stratify and how they crumble under certain loads and everything. And part of that is because he helped work on this idea of tunneling using these nuclear explosions. One paper that I'd seen a couple years ago shows that he came up or helped design this idea for another deflector dish for underground nuclear tunneling. What would happen is you would explode this directional nuke, and half of the explosion would go one way and half would go the other way, and he used this reflector that would reflect all the X-rays back in the direction that you want it to go, and so you could tunnel very, very far, very, very quickly. And in order to be able to model that well, you have to understand how rocks react to different kinds of stimuli like X-rays or thermal or whatever other kinds of explosive reactions rocks are going to undergo when you detonate a nuke underground.
Yeah. So you mentioned the binders. There were probably, I would say, over 50, maybe between 50 and 100 binders. As you said, just about every 6 months in his professional career, he started a new binder. And we're talking about like 1959 through, you know, like the 2010s, I think, you know, as well as having probably another 30 or 40 binders for topical issues in his closet, right? He would just have different topics he had done research on or done papers on. He additionally had a massive set of binders for teaching, right? Because he started out at the Desert Research Institute. He ended up teaching at the local university system. So he had binders for all of his students and their work. And then he had, we counted, I think, over 30 boxes full of papers and binders and photocopies and handwritten notes and all of that. So altogether, this was thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of material. And one of the important points, kind of surprising for me, was this definitely was cleaned probably several times, probably over a period of years. I didn't find one single document that said classified. I did find several that said declassified, right? Things that had been classified, he would attach them to research that he had done. In some cases, he would share them with his students. So, you know, he followed the rules very well in that regard.
He was very much a rule follower. One letter I found, which was talking about just post one of these cleanup events, he mentioned that he had over 100,000 pages, between 200 of these binders. And that was not a new letter. That was a letter from like the 70s, right? So halfway through his career, if not less than halfway. So the number of records that he had originally and the number of records that we saw, while we did see a lot of records, I suspect we only saw a portion of what he originally had before any of these cleanup events.
Okay. So going away from UFOs for just a moment and focusing on these files, one of the things that interested me was this idea of lost information, right? And one of the things that we saw was going through and trying to scan and archive, there was simply too much for us to save it all. And a lot of it is stuff that it's questionable, right? Like, for instance, if you do a photocopy out of a book or a magazine or something like that, it's already published, right? And he was citing all sorts of stuff. But then the question becomes, if he has handwritten notes and it's associated with it, how important is that, right? And for me, this really brought home this larger issue of America's nuclear scientists, as well as a lot of other specialized disciplines, are aging themselves out of society, right? I mean, he passed away at a very ripe old age. As you know, we've lost a lot of tremendous scientists over the last decade, right? The Cold War produced this massive body of specialized research, and that's leaving us. I've read that Los Alamos and Sandia are struggling with that. They're losing their culture of nuclear expertise. And so for me, there's also this aspect of how can we, not just you and me, we as a society, preserve and honor this legacy?
Yes, you said it so well. So we had about 2 generations of people who witnessed all of these bomb tests, right? They were eyewitnesses to seeing what happens when you explode the largest bomb man has ever been able to make, right? And what that does for your knowledge, as well as for just your moral standing on how the world works, right? Very different mentality, very different world view than people who are being brought up now, who the only thing they have to go on is pictures and some old grainy videos of these things. They had no recollection of the Cold War and the fear that was always present. They had no recollection of World War II when these bombs were used in war. There's a continual degradation just from what I'm seeing as an outsider. It seems like there's a continual degradation in our ability to preserve all of this knowledge, to preserve all of this motivation, to continue this research, because this research should be continued. We had this grandiose idea back in the 50s that we were entered the atomic age, the atomic era, right? And there was these very idyllic views on how we were going to be able to harness all of these different power sources for the betterment of mankind, right? Rather than use it for its destructive purposes, use it for its constructive purposes. We've seen fusion or fission reactors crop up here and there. There hasn't been a new one for a very long time because the costs associated with it are so heavy.
Yeah.
The only way that we're going to be able to see energy independence and to remove ourselves from fossil fuels, as well as from the potential for nuclear fallout when you have another Fukushima-like event or another 3 Mile Island-like event where these fission reactors melt down. The only way we're going to be able to get away from that is with fusion, nuclear fusion. And I think Dr. Winterberg figured that out a long time ago, that the answer is fusion. Part of the problem, though, is that fusion research is so closely tied with all of this super classified stuff that you can't necessarily release the advancements that your team has made without risk of enabling your country's enemies to be able to develop weapons from that. It's quite an unfortunate thing, and Dr. Winterberg was fully aware of how unfortunate this was, that you couldn't declassify this type of fusion research, especially when the advancements that he was making were leaps and bounds beyond anything anyone had ever come up with before. Initially, our ability to attain fusion was next to zero, and thanks to Dr. Winterberg, he made orders of magnitudes increases in the viability of the potential for this to become a thing. Whether or not we actually achieved it in the SDI era is a little bit questionable. I haven't seen a smoking gun yet, other than the flying triangles, maybe. And we're always told that nuclear fusion is another 10 to 30 years out, just repeatedly. It's always that much far out. Well, part of the problem why that's so far out is because there's a lot of research out there, not just by Dr. Winterberg, but by other government-related scientists as well, who made such great strides, and those strides aren't recognized because it's classified.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, he explored so many different nuts and bolts aspects of it, right? Can you initiate it this way? Can you shield it that way? Can you control it this way? So a lot of it was, it's not just, can we build a bomb? Can we build it bigger? It's more like, how can we utilize this and harness it and more efficiently control this for the betterment of mankind, as well as exploring space. Again, this was a consistent theme. This was one of his big themes, was we can use this to get to other planets, other solar systems, start to explore our galaxy, right?
And on another note on his fusion research, Dr. Winterberg passed away in 2022. in 2018 to 2020, he had signed an NDA for Lockheed so that he could help Lockheed with their fusion reactor design that they had been working on. Now, there's a lot of different versions of fusion reactors out there, and a number of them employ Dr. Winterberg's ideas. But Lockheed had a slightly different model that they were working on, and they asked Dr. Winterberg to come in as a consultant, and he had to sign all the papers, and I won't disclose, exactly what you're doing here. But the paper that he wrote up after the fact on what he did, because he wanted everybody to know what he did, that paper is publicly available, and you can see the kinds of major lateral thinking that he was still capable of at ages like 94, 95 years old. He was still with it enough that he was able to give Lockheed a totally different method than they'd been trying before. It doesn't appear as though Lockheed has actually employed his ideas, though they might reconsider doing so. But part of his idea was, instead of using a single tokamak-like reactor where you're spinning the plasma around, that if you actually have two reactors stacked atop each other and you counter-rotate the beams like that, well, you can utilize the fields produced by that to help balance out these beams, because chaos and nonlinearities abound in fusion systems. These things do not want to stay stable, and that's part of the biggest problem, is you can't have stable fusion. You can do it for a nanosecond, but you can't do it for, hours. Well, when you stack them on top of each other like that, those instabilities start to even out a little bit better. In addition, there might be some other interesting side effects that come from that, which Dr. Winterberg hints to in some of his papers. Some other papers written by the Air Force Research and others are suggesting that there may very well be anti-gravity properties. And in fact, in that Lockheed paper by Dr. Winterberg, he talks about negative masses occurring in the center of the toroids. It's possible, and this is pure speculation, but it's possible, based upon what I've seen from Dr. Winterberg's work, that when you crack the nut of fusion, you are simultaneously able to crack the nut of anti-gravity and propulsion, which might help explain part of the reason why it has remained so secret. Because anti-gravity technology, for the longest time, has remained very, very secret. If any advancements have been made over the last 80 years by the US government or other governments, we haven't seen the smoking gun on how exactly such systems operate. We have a lot of speculations, but that smoking gun has never quite been there.
Well, this takes me to his students and continuing that culture of specialized knowledge, right? One of the things you had wondered about is whether or not one or more of his students may have gone on to develop the TR-3B. Do you think that's possible? I mean, is it close enough to his conceptualization of propulsion, I guess, to have come from the work of the people that he helped educate, that he was close to and he mentored?
I could see that as a possibility. I wouldn't commit to it one way or another. And the reason why is because the time frame when we see where he was working on this stuff, he was not doing a whole lot of teaching. He was doing some teaching around that time. He had to keep his position. But it seemed as though he spent more than 60% of his time simply doing research, because he was simultaneously employed with Desert Research Institute and University of Nevada, or the Nevada Education System, I should say. So he balanced his time between those two, but you could tell his heart was really into the research side more than the teaching side, at least during that time. Then you come over to the 2000s and the late 90s, and you see that it seems as though he really became a pretty good professor. All of his students seem to have pretty good reviews about him during those years. And then towards the tail end of things, he started having all these different issues with the university, and things were not going so well there towards the end. So I don't necessarily know that he left the school on a good note, because he had started wanting to make sure that he had his legacy retained, and the school was not really wanting that to happen.
Well, and again, it's such a tremendous legacy. So when we were going through working with the family, I found a box that was just postcards, and it took me a moment to realize what those were. These were postcards from various scientists and scientific organizations, all over the world asking for reprints of his papers, right? And this was back in the day, back before the internet. And so the only way to get that paper was either in a journal if it was published there, or perhaps they had heard about it, like in a magazine or something specialized. They would write to him to request that. And indeed, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of these postcards. We had an entire box full of them. The thing that intrigued me was, I mean, every major organization in the United States, right? You had university professors doing nuclear research of all sorts, as well as like, you know, General Electric, every company, you know, involved with atomic research at the time. You had major government organizations, different departments within the DoD, like the Department of the Army and things like that. And again, this is over a period of time, right? So things had changed, right? I believe the Army at first, and the Air Force, and then later the DoD, and you know, the whole 9 yards there. But in addition to that, you had major scientific organizations in Japan that wanted to correspond with him and learn more about his work. And the part that got me, I thought there was some humor in this, I probably had 15 to 20 postcards from the USSR. I had at least 12 from Russia, right, from within Russia, and they're all marked USSR, asking for copies of his work on fusion, and then many more from Russian-controlled countries, right, part of the Soviet bloc, like Czechoslovakia was one. I had many, many postcards from scientists there. And I just thought, you know, his work was so well known worldwide that even, you know, our mortal enemy at the time is writing to learn more about it. And the part that I'd wondered about, and I never got an answer, was whether or not he sent that to them. So
I saw some documents about something called technology transfer. And there was this idea, especially as the Cold War was winding down, that in order to establish good relations between the USSR and the US, we wanted to be able to exchange ideas, right, between our scientists. Like, we'd been cut off from each other scientifically for so long. As we start to lift that iron curtain, to be able to have these scientists be able to all of a sudden exchange all of these ideas and these advancements that both sides had made, it was a big deal. And Dr. Winterberg writes about this in a couple of his letters. He talks about how it's not even a technology transfer where we give them a piece of something. It's just the knowledge transfer alone has massive value. And so he was looking for permission, although he seemed to ask forgiveness more than permission on occasion. But he was looking for ways to be able to share his ideas with all of these people from all over the world, including our mortal enemies, the Soviets, right? He wanted this technology of fusion to become a reality. He saw it as the only viable future for humanity in so many ways, both for energy and propulsion. He ended up sharing that stuff, and we can see that through all of these postcards. He ended up building relationships with so many different professionals from so many different walks of life. It wasn't just the plasma fusion guys that were interested in him. He has connections to guys over in neuroscience. He has connections to people that are researching completely unrelated stuff for the military equipment, for different militaries throughout the world. He was so prolific and so well renowned by so many that his passing, I think, was felt across the planet.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I guess I should ask, because I think that we're kind of running through a lot of the major aspects of this. What was something that surprised you the most, I guess?
I think getting to talk to his daughter and getting a feel for who the man was outside of his profession, right? Being able to take a peek behind the papers and see who was this person at home instead of who was this person at work. And what I found out was that Dr. Winterberg was, he was very old school, right? He was born in 1929. He was part of the German youth back during World War II. He was from a very affluent family. He came from great means. He went to very prestigious schools. He studied under the most prestigious scientists, right? This man thought very highly of himself. And so he had an inability, it seems, to connect with people who he didn't find to be his intellectual peers, even including his family at times. And that is unfortunate, that with such a great mind, to have this other side of the coin where he was really good at connecting with other scientists, but it didn't seem like he always connected well at a personal level with other people, or to include his family. There was a lot of drama. You and I both saw a lot of papers with just a lot of drama that went on behind the scenes with this man, because he had a very strong sense of justice, and if anybody crossed him, he didn't like that at all. He made sure that he chased them down like a dog chasing a bone. He wanted to make sure that things were made right in any instance that he felt that he was wronged. And that's something that you don't see when you read all of his research papers. That's something that you don't see unless you actually get to have a little peek behind the curtain, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that I found most surprising was actually that book right behind you, the Planck Aether Hypothesis. I had no idea that he had developed a completely independent theory of physics. I think that's absolutely remarkable. And one of the things that seems the most remarkable about it was he came from such a rigorous school of physics. And like, as you've said, folks like that, they tend to make up their mind and staunchly defend their opinions and, and what they come up with, right? And in his case, he branched out and he created something that is completely new. Now, neither one of us are physicists, but I mean, I know that you've gone through this. Do you think that there's validity there to it?
I think it would be better for me to point at the other physicists who think that there might be validity there. So he had been coming up with this idea of the Planck ether and negative masses and something called rotons, which I'm not going to get into, but he'd been developing this theory for so long. Robert L. Ford, who in the world of alternative propulsion is a big name that a lot of people recognize. There's a lot of correspondence between Robert Ford and Dr. Winterberg, especially surrounding this idea. Dr. Ford was very interested in this idea. He never seemed to commit one way or another towards whether it was valid, but he seemed to always want to know more about it. He was very, very interested in it. And he wasn't alone. He wasn't the only one. Dr. Winterberg sent out this idea to a lot of different people. And it seems like the idea never quite gained traction as it could have had more people looked at it. I think Astrid was telling me yesterday that like 5 people bought this book last year, right? And altogether, there's probably only been 50 copies ever sold or something like that. Like, not a lot of copies of this have made it out there.
Well, when you have a completely independent theory like that, and I've received several of these from different people, right? And one of the challenges is you really have to dig in to understand it, to tell if it even has the potential to be real. And so, regardless of his pedigree, the problem is most of the people he was sending this to probably simply didn't have the time to go through it.
The time or the chops to be able to adequately understand his theory. You have to have a very deep knowledge of a very niche field of physics, which a lot of people don't have. I think that he had to refine this theory over so many decades because it was such a niche. He had to constantly go and ask for help from all these other physicists to take his idea, review it, tell him what he's got wrong. And that iterative process of refinement, he did for decades and decades and decades before he felt like it was refined well enough to share publicly through the form of a book.
So one of the other things that I found incredibly surprising was how many of the names in his correspondence were people that I had met at the ISNPS STAFE conference. And I guess that shouldn't be a surprise, for the listeners, I guess. That's the Institute of Space and Nuclear Power Studies, which is through the University of New Mexico in conjunction with the U.S. Air Force. It was a very long-running conference. Basically, it was the Space Nuclear Conference. And they had papers relating to all types of nuclear power, propulsion, fusion, things along those lines in space. I recall going there and meeting many of these scientists, and I was in my 20s when I went to those conferences, and so I had no idea who they were. So here I am later in life seeing correspondence with people, and actually I've reached out to a few of them and said, hey, Winterberg and you were corresponding. I would love to follow up with you. And so that's something that we'll probably do more of in the future. But again, it reinforces this idea of this tight-knit community, you know? And you actually mentioned earlier that he had reviewed some of the papers by people in our own alt propulsion community, right? So again, a small group of people who seem to be well familiar with each other's ideas.
Yeah, even just this morning, as I continue to go through the massive amount of papers that we've gotten over this last week, I was seeing that he had been reviewing papers by Dr. Paul Murad. I'd seen that he'd been reviewing papers from Dr. Pais. He'd been reviewing a lot of these alternative propulsion ideas that have continued to come out even after he had retired. He was still completely fascinated by this idea of alternative propulsion. And I don't think that fascination ever went away.
Jack Sarfati, I saw several of Jack's papers in there as well.
Yep.
You know, yeah, and again, that's just on the propulsion side of things. And then there were so many papers that he reviewed. So one thing I think that I should mention, and again, you and I saw this, but it's worth mentioning for anybody who watches, so much of those boxes was full of photocopies of magazine articles or you know, journals, scientific papers, you know, I mean, I'm just trying to think of all the different places. Textbooks where he would photocopy something and put it in, and then he would add his own material to it. Sometimes that was a written document, other times it was just notes. In a few instances, he would literally just scribble on it and do his equations on that, right? So. Yep,
it's not surprising that he branched out as far as he did and that he did as much as he did. The man had over 250 publications. He has an H-index of like 2,500 or 3,000 or something. He's very well cited. Part of the reason for that is because he was so smart. In fact, he was so smart that he was even invited to go speak at some Mensa conferences. Mensa being the institute for people with an IQ of 190 or more, right? The man was very, very intelligent, and I think that he was able to utilize that intelligence in a lot of different areas, and wherever he set his focus and set his desire to know more, he would accomplish what he set out to do, and he would become an expert in whatever field he tried to set his mind to.
Well, so we should probably wrap things up by talking about what we can take away from this, as well as what the audience can take away from it. I mean, again, he has so many papers online that people can learn from. What are some of the things that we found, I think, that are really valuable and need to help continue his legacy?
I think from the alternative propulsion side, taking a much deeper look into the work that he did during the SDI days in the 90s. I'm continuing to look through that and being able to draw connections between these proposals that he had that never saw the light of day other than the Air Force or the Navy or whoever it was that he was sending each of these proposals to. But when you go through those and you look at who he was writing those proposals up with, that's where you can start drawing these connections to see just how well connected this guy was to the program, right? The reverse engineering program or the alternative propulsion program that the government has had for a long time. That's one thing. On another side, for his professional career in plasma physics, I think that if we're going to see any meaningful progress in that area, that people who are working on that should become even more intimately familiar with his ideas. Because even if he didn't necessarily write about the exact problem that you're trying to solve at the moment, I guarantee you he has in his reference documents, which are also impressive, he has referenced others who have worked on it, because the man was so meticulous about making sure that everybody who deserved credit got credit, including himself. So for people working on plasma, make sure that you familiarize yourself very deeply with Dr. Winterberg's work. The man was an absolute genius, so prolific, and such a lateral thinker that some of his solutions are things that I don't think anyone else came up with, or if they did, they came up with it on their own many decades later.
Well, and I would say, to close things out, I think the biggest takeaway for me is finding this incredible piece of American history, but also world history. And it speaks to so much change that happened during the Cold War, right? And I think because of the secrecy, that's something that is being lost. And it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy from a scientific basis, but also from a cultural basis, to really know what happened, right? These were the people that were protecting us. They were trying to build the future. They were trying to create a better world for everyone. And like Winterberg, most of them had very, very idealistic views of that, you know? And so for me, I think that is kind of the biggest takeaway, is having this glimpse into this secret history of science and technology.
Well said. Thanks, Tim. This has been really nice.